All right, so I want to start with a little story about the restaurant on the far left, 14 Ma Street. It was known as Monfar Lo, and the Chinese held so many grand celebrations at it that it deserves a place in history. It was established in 1885, just as the Chinese population in New York was becoming sizable. And in the early years, the entrance was unmarked. So it was actually quite difficult to find the stairway to the second-story restaurant nestled inside a tenement apartment building. While its appearances were plain, the food was not. English speakers nicknamed it the Oriental Delmonico's. So this was in homage to Delmonico's restaurant, which was the most famous restaurant in the United States at the time, and allegedly the first restaurant to ever open. Like its namesake, Oriental Delmonico's was known for style and fancy dishes, and New York's Chinese held many fancy banquets there, lavish celebratory meals in honor of individuals and for special occasions like Chinese New Year. The chef cooked with ingredients sourced from across Asia, imported to New York by way of Hong Kong. At these banquets, so many plates covered the dining table that, quote, even the deaf Chinese waiter could not have added the tiniest saucer to that array, end quote. Interestingly enough, 3 years later, after its opening by 1888, hundreds of white Americans and European immigrants were dining in Chinatown in, quote, orthodox fashion with chopsticks, end quote. But they came not for the banquet food, but for plain and simple fare. On ordinary days, restaurants like Monfar Lo served a double purpose. They served a limited menu made of ready-made dishes for 5 cents to 25 cents. Chop suey was a favorite amongst this population of people. And for the curious but cautious, it was a gateway food. The New York Post editor, Alan Foreman, called it, quote, a toothsome stew. And this was humble dish from southern China became a beacon calling across a broad section of Americans to Chinatown. Initially, only locals and reporters came to Chinatown, but in time, middling and elite Americans trekked from their uptown residences, social clubs, and dining halls also to Chinatown. And eventually, out-of-town tourists also followed. So I'm here today to tell you an origin story of Chinese restaurants in the United States. Its beginnings and spread traces actually to restaurants like Monfar Lo and other late 19th century pioneers. Louis Beck, a contemporary of Foreman working at the Police Gazette, described these kinds of restaurants as, quote, most gorgeously decorated and illuminated buildings in Chinatown. So I want to explain how a handful of restaurants in New York City introduced America to Chinese food. And this is really in contrast to what we think of as San Francisco's role in this story. My story begins in the 1870s with the earliest documented examples of cross-cultural dining and concludes in the 1940s with Chinese restaurant owners following the pattern of outward suburban outmigration. Places like Monfar Lo were sites of friendly contact. The Chinese were hoping to bridge divides that were separating them from everybody else. So this talk then starts with the anti-Chinese movement. It started at the end of Reconstruction when racial nationalists, to borrow Gary Gristle's term, were redirecting their energy from freed African Americans to the Chinese. The Chinese fought back, of course, and food was one of their tools. So part one of this talk will be about the political strategy, food as a political strategy to undermine the anti-Chinese agenda. Unfortunately, it failed at the most important level, but it left an enduring legacy that Americans had sympathy for the Chinese through their appreciation of food. The reporters, for instance, quoted earlier, were really sort of important to that process. Newspapers were enlisted in this project, and they helped spread knowledge about Chinese food far and wide. Part two of this talk will be about consumers, and in particular, I'm going to focus just on one population, which is white American women, and how their patronage actually normalized Chinese restaurants, turning it into a mainstream institution that we know it today. However, they were not civic nationalists, the other counterpart of Gary Gristle's story, the people who fought hard for inclusion. The customers, at least, were more self-interested. They were seeking to expand their own freedoms, not necessarily inclusion for marginalized people. The civic nationalists in this story were actually the Chinese, who were unable to naturalize and unable to vote. They turned instead to culture to create space in American society for themselves, what I call innovation at the margins. So I'm telling you a story of how politically disenfranchised populations make power. And it's offering a different conceptualization of American culture, one that links efforts at political mobilizing and legal outcomes with cultural representation. So I'm showing you how culture and politics are not operating on separate levels, but actually are interlocked. Part 3 is more familiar to more people, which is the angle of how then the Chinese recognize these opportunities, not only on an economic angle, but also on an immigration angle, how they use Chinese restaurants, in fact, to soften discriminatory laws. So let me just step back. I'm sure all of you guys know of Chinese food, but why tell this story? Why? I mean, we know Chinese food is good, we know Chinese food is common, but why should we care about this story? Well, first of all, the foodie celebration of cross-cultural eating needs to be interrogated. The pursuit of authenticity is annoyingly ahistorical, but also the position of racialized celebrities that promote foodie culture is also not interrogated for the racial politics that they embody. And this whole trend of cross-cultural eating started with the Chinese in the midst of the height of the anti-Chinese movement. So that means that we must account for racism and racial nationalism. So I'm making an argument about the production of hegemonic American culture through the legal marginality of the key actors. So unless we see their contribution, we are perpetuating a racial nationalist force of self-congratulation. This means today, seeing undocumented delivery men from Africa and Latin America whizzing in all weathers, as I see there's Thayer Street signs for delivery. And it's in order to shift what and who we value, more tangibly also rewarding them appropriately. As this story I hope will show, change happens when powerful allies, privileged allies like ourselves, align ourselves with their causes. So I'm offering you a theory of culture and change to also reframe immigration history. We tend to think of the relationship between immigrants and mainstream culture unidirectionally, right? The immigrants have one of two options with mainstream culture, to either assimilate or be isolationist. This talk then emphasizes the intersection of the two, how these interactions between these populations, of course, structured by racial ideology, but how I'm interested in how then these two, Chinese but marginalized populations in general, are able to push against racial ideologies to create spaces for themselves. And I'm going to have to compress that section of this talk a little bit. So, all right, the fun stuff of racial nationalism. So we normally think of consumer culture like Chinese restaurants or restaurants in general very differently. However, in fact, they were started by anti-Chinese laws that created a real and immediate incentive to go into the restaurant industry. So I'm going to start with a little bit of historical context. In the 1870s was a troubling time for America. 1873 was the Great Panic. First, it was the bankruptcy of a big Philadelphia bank that led to the collapse of the railroad industry, railroad construction, and a lot of related industries. This sparked, in turn, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This was a big national campaign that was coordinated across cities. They were protesting, of course, wage depression. Recently, wages were cut by a third, and there was massive unemployment in a wide spectrum of industries. The California protests were, of course, in alliance with the national project, but they were different from the rest. They combined anti-capitalist demands for higher wages, shorter hours, with restriction on Chinese immigration to protect white labor. So it very differently was directed towards the Chinese. And this led to the birth of the anti-Chinese movement, which was spearheaded by Dennis Kearney. He led the anti-Chinese agenda from the streets of California, San Francisco, to the halls of Congress. And he very smartly was able to recognize the mass movement to the ballot boxes was going to be a key leveraging point. So he formed the Working Man's Party of California that leveraged the bitterness of working men in elections, chanting famously, "The Chinese must go." Now, there were two key consequences of the anti-Chinese movement. First of all, it's the Chinese question, whether or not they should be allowed into the country, became a key voting issue. And this was something that both parties were able to agree on, which limiting Chinese immigration was worth it in order to gain votes. That led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which, as Beth Lou Williams illustrates, was both a failure by design and accident. There were too many concessions in the original law because of treaty obligations. We really wanted China as a treaty partner, so we made all these concessions in order to keep them. But of course, it failed to actually end Chinese immigration. What it did, though, in response, was that the US started to modify and expand these laws, and we really see a moment of the United States turning into a gatekeeping country as we know it today. President Cleveland, for instance, declared it for the first time before Congress that it was a sovereign right to regulate Chinese or immigration in general, and this was a power that Congress upheld in a key Supreme Court, the Supreme Court upheld in a key case called Chen Chai-ping versus the United States. So immigration then no longer was a diplomatic matter, but it became the domestic question that we now know it today, and that Trump is clearly mobilizing. As a result, the Chinese were also our first racialized illegal immigrants. They were racialized regardless of their status, treated very differently on the street, but more importantly, it robbed them of their political voice, their ability to work officially through democratic channels, because they couldn't naturalize. If you couldn't naturalize, you could also not vote. The second impact of the anti-Chinese movement was that they left the American West. There was a huge outbreak of violence against them, and many of them went east. As a result, the smaller communities of Chinese already on the East Coast were transformed. New York specifically, there were only a few hundred before the 1870s, and these were mostly transient sailors that would come for shore leave for a few days or a few weeks, but then they would leave. So now all of a sudden we have a permanent population all around workers. In New York in 1880, the first census after the Sandlot riots, 80% of the Chinese in New York were, quote, excluded laborers. They were laundrymen, cigar makers, domestic servants, and seamen. So as you can tell by this map, residences, which is a map of residences, they were not concentrated in Chinatown or in Lower Manhattan as is commonly perceived, but they were distributed across the island. Chinatown then, when in fact, was a commercial center. Sundays was a day in which most working men had off. Laundries, for instance, were closed. And the streets of Chinatown came alive with people as a result. American residents complained. They claimed very angrily. In a letter to the mayor, a man named George F. Miller, who lived at 43 Mott Street, just a couple blocks away from what is now Chinatown, called it an intolerable nuisance. Weekend visitors from other parts of this and neighboring cities took over sidewalks that rightfully belonged to Christian residents, forcing them to walk in the middle of the street. They demanded city officials to intervene, and the police responded by surprising the Chinese at night at their busiest times in solidarity with the Working Men's Party in California. So this is one of the earliest examples of state-sanctioned harassment of the Chinese on the East Coast, and they claimed that it was to stamp out immorality of operating on Sundays and doing things that were antithetical to American culture. However, the Chinese were not passive. They organized. There was an organization called the Chinese Six Companies that was formed in California in order to defend against these attacks. The number 6 comes from the number of originally founding organizations because the Chinese tended to be divided by linguistic category. It actually still exists today, and its main branch is in New York. So they asked the Chinese in New York asked the 6 companies for help. And the man they sent was a person named Tom Lee. His Chinese name is Wang Aling, and he was called the Mayor of Chinatown. He emigrated to San Francisco in the 1860s. Little is known about him during this early period, but Scott Seligman says that he was a labor contractor, which meant that he recruited and organized workers for white industrialists and agriculture. And Cornell Chang, who's written about these individuals, have described how key they were to the creation of the American West, as really bringing the people who created industry, farming, et cetera, et cetera. If true, this meant that Tom Lee was a very capable broker between Chinese and Americans. In addition to that, he also stood out for his strange commitment to integrating. He naturalized in 1876. He spoke English, although imperfectly, and he also married a German-American woman named Minnie Kaler. His first address that you see down here at 4 Mott Street was on the border between a Chinese and Irish neighborhood. He opened a cigar shop on the bottom. He lived above with his wife and mixed-race children. And his brother-in-law, also German-American, helped run the shop. This area, very interestingly, was a stronghold of Tammany, which is the Democratic Party machine that controlled city politics. And the Irish had been dominating this party since the 1850s. Tammany was a natural enemy of the Chinese. It's the same population as the Working Man Party in California, men of European descent, mainly Irish. Kearney, for instance, was from northwestern Ireland, the Sandlot order who demanded the Chinese must go. Out of all this, Lee did something very unexpected. He curried favor with Tammany Hall. He made them into allies. And this is a political strategy of the disenfranchised. Make those empower your friends. And he honored them with a Chinese banquet. So this is a coverage of the first one from 1878, August 10th, 1878. And this was for a man named Edmund E. Price. He was a lawyer who actually helped the Chinese in several raids, were arrested out of nowhere by the police. Price becomes a lifelong partner of Tom Lee. He helps file his legal name change to Tom Lee, as well as file the paperwork for formation of multiple organizations. He also helped Tom Lee secure the first official title in government for the Chinese, which was as a deputy sheriff. Chinese banquets, as you would imagine, were elaborate feasts. This menu specifically included suckling pig, fish, oyster, chicken 2 ways, duck and pigeon, champagne and rice wine flowed through the night. There was even a musical performance, and Tom Lee also performed. He apparently really liked playing the Chinese banjo, as it was described. Guests would recline in their seats, puffing on cigars and slurping the last dregs of tea and alcohol. This form of celebration was actually borrowed from China. Merchants in Canton, what we now know as Guangzhou, was a port city, and Chinese merchants hosted foreigners. And what they were doing was actually incorporating foreigners into what were known as guanxi networks, which is relationships of mutual obligation. What you would do is you do business with one another, help one another. This is what Tom Lee was attempting to do. The Chinese earlier in California had tried this strategy, and Haiming Liu, who's written a book about California, talks about gold rush dinners. However, they failed to amount to much political power, at least in San Francisco, because there it was dominated by anti-Chinese politics. New York, in contrast, they had much more successes, but this was not because New York was pro-Chinese, but they were definitely not anti-Chinese the way and to the degree that San Francisco was. Chinese were still treated with suspicion and unwelcome, as you can tell by the police raid, but they were not despised and hated in the same way. This opening allowed Lee to make inroads into Tammany, and he became their most famous Chinese member. Tammany used to throw these summer parties called chowder fests, and these were like basically free vacations where you would bring your voting population who couldn't afford to take vacations out into the countryside. There would be games for the children, free food and alcohol. It was a big party. It was to make people feel good leading up to an election. I mean, I hear Buddy Cianci used to do that. And Lee, interestingly enough, was always present in these chowder fests, and he would bring an entourage. He would also set up Chinese games, gambling games, Fantan, for people to play so that you could, engage with him on his terms, I guess. He, very interestingly enough, threw his own versions of these parties, and Tammany would also be invited and in attendance. Chinese banquets, in other words, like these summer parties, were the exterior sign of Lee's power, by expense and prestige of the attendees, And they were also tapping into existing trends amongst New York's elites at this point, who threw Gilded Age parties to draw circles of friendship of who was included and who was excluded. There was a man during this period very famously known as being the gatekeeper, the guardian of what were called the New York 400, which literally meant only 400 people were important in New York City. So to make it onto that list, to make it onto Ward Allister's list meant that you were included amongst New York's elite. Lee's dinner was actually doing something very similar. He was mimicking the strategy of social display. Newspapermen described his parties as, quote, would not have been a disgrace to a petite supper on Murray Hill, end quote. This was a comment from a New York Herald reporter who attended, in fact, Lee's first dinner. So what you're seeing here is how clever Lee was with PR. He invited newspaper reporters who published a list of attendees, and this was a political act to advertise who his allies were. And as a result, Tom Lee actually became the best-known Chinese in America. And this was partially as a coincidence of what was happening in publishing at the same time. It was the creation of what we now know as the national news cycle. There was a growing circulation of news in general that were going nationally. There were also new populations of people reading, women and immigrants specifically. And it was also a moment of what we now know of as syndication. So newswires, for instance, were spreading news into far deeper areas. So articles about Lee's first dinner and beyond appeared as far as California, Oregon, Kentucky, Illinois, so on and so forth. So while Chinese banquets failed as a political strategy in the most meaningful way, the biggest campaign that Lee was behind was actually the fight for naturalization. This was not, at least in the early period, formally protected. The 1790 Naturalization Act really kind of excluded Asian by omission, and so did the opportunity at the end of Reconstruction to modify, or end of the Civil War to change that. But thankfully for people like Tom Lee, it was generally relatively loosely regulated, which meant that some people were able to naturalize through city courts instead of through federal courts. Lee founded an organization called the Hom Tong, which urged all Chinese to declare their first intent. So that is the first step to naturalization. And they were actually trying to push a federal ruling on this issue between state and federal policy. Chinese exclusion, of course, forecloses that route. So the Chinese, in the end, lost in formal politics. But what they gained, and what we gained, is the enduring legacy of the Chinese banquet. These articles drummed up interest in Chinese food, and Lee was the first to open a Chinese restaurant, because he likes to be the first, as you can tell. 1880 was the year in which he turned his residence into a first formal restaurant. He was a single owner, and others followed very quickly afterwards, like Montfarlot in 1885. These were normally a few Chinese pooled the resources in order to open a restaurant as a collaborative. The reporting actually transformed restaurants as spaces into points of interest. They're really sort of the early version of what we now think of as restaurant reviews. They focus on the decor as well as the food. They explain customs as well, like how to eat with chopsticks. Everybody was very anxious about that. And as well as how to properly drink your tea. Please no sugar and milk, as it was constantly insisted. So these were didactic. They showed readers how to experience Chinese restaurants, what to order, they told you dishes, and also where to eat. They gave you addresses. Knowledge of Chinese food then expanded from Chinese banquets as a fanciful event to Chinese restaurants as an accessible entry point. Chinese food then became something that people read about and recognized. This fascination with Chinese food was helped along by the visit of a Chinese diplomat to New York in 1896. This man is named Hom Tong, and he was very well liked in America at the time, partially because he was more receptive to Western ideas. And another reason why was that he hosted President Grant at the end of his world tour in China to a big, fanciful banquet. You see him Grant, as you can guess, and Hom Tong on the left. When Hom Tong came to New York City, as you can tell, he was very well greeted on the right by reporters, by people who were eager to, curry favor with China. When he came to New York, he went immediately to Grant's newly opened tomb, and he dedicated a ginkgo tree, which is surprisingly still alive and very big. So if you ever are on the Upper West Side, want to visit Grant's tomb, say hello to the ginkgo tree, because you can also thank this man for another stage of the popularization of Chinese food. So a few things happened result of Li Hongzhang's tour. First of all, the fame of a dish I mentioned earlier in the introduction, chop suey, became extremely famous. He created a chop suey craze. He's wrongly credited for having invented chop suey. He had nothing to do with it. He probably never ate it. But Chinese restaurateurs were very clever. They were like, oh, Americans are really interested in China now. Okay, we can tell them that Li Hongzhang really loved chop suey and sell it to them. Americans bought it wholesale. They were very excited about chop suey as a result. The second thing that happened because of Li Hongzhang was the birth of commercial tourism. What some people call slumming, I prefer a different term, commercialized tourism to Chinatown. These tours, you would go to the Buddhist shrine, Chinese opera, Piernan opium den. You would also go shopping in stores. And of course, as you can imagine, you would eat at a Chinese restaurant at the end of your meal. These trips cost $2 a head. That was double any kind of urban tour going on at the time. And I've looked at the guidebooks. So these were quite expensive. And this was roughly the equivalent of about $50 a day. So the cost of going on one of the red line tours, if you've ever gone on them. If you haven't, they're great. So, think of it as the equivalent of that. People rode in horse-drawn carriages from uptown hotel districts like the Flatiron down to Chatham Square, and tourists were called rubberneckers because you would be craning your neck as far as possible out of the bus in order to gawk at the Chinese on the street or others on the street. This image, as you see here, they're standing before a Chinese restaurant called Chinese Delmonico's, in contrast to Oriental Delmonico's. Everybody wants to be a Delmonico's. This is 24 Pell Street. You will notice in the photo that most of the people are women, white women, well-dressed. So you can imagine by the cost of the trip that you needed to have a fair amount of resources. And I take this as rather significant. And I'm going to use this to move to our second part, which is on the consumers, to talk about race and gender. Let's also assume that most of the tourists were also not from New York City, but from out of town. In the early 20th century, Jessie Osborne Robinson received a postcard of Chinese tuxedo, which was located on 2 Dwyer Street, right on Chatham Square. Robinson led a quiet existence in Montouise, Connecticut, which was a village in the Quinnipiac River. She was a middle-aged housewife, lived on a farm with her husband, children, and mother. The sender signed the postcard on Grace. Unfortunately, because I don't have a last name, her identity is untraceable. But what I do know about her was that she was sightseeing in New York City. And the day in which she posted this, she started the day early, and it ended with eating in a Chinese restaurant. We all had Chinese chicken chop suey. No mention of Statue of Liberty, no mention of Central Park, or even of Times Square that was recently opened. These were typical tourist destinations. The only thing she talked about was the Chinese restaurant. Bessie Casebeer, a 26-year-old teacher from Nebraska, also took a tour of Chinatown. She traveled with 100 delegates of the state of Nebraska's National Education Association to attend their annual meeting in Boston. The event was actually an excuse in which the women designed a 2-month itinerary to, quote, important centers of interest in the Midwest and the Northeast. The trip to Chinatown that the Nebraskan teachers took was sandwiched between a boat tour up the Hudson River, a stroll through Central Park, and a visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Of course, we can say that maybe some of this is not new. Women have been going to impoverished neighborhoods to do good for decades, but these women were not about education, they were not about charity, but they were about sensorial enjoyment. This is what Bessie said about her event. Then entering the Chinese Delmonico, we were served at little tables inlaid with pearl, a dish of dry cooked rice, chop suey, golden lime preserves, with chopsticks thrown in, end quote. What were these out-of-town white women doing in Chinatown? And just a side note, I'm going to have to flatten most differences of class and ethnicity and talk about this Q&A. It was very unusual to see them in Chinatown at the turn of the century. This was primarily because Chinatown was thought of as unsafe, and to women specifically, These dangers to them were rhetorical and imaginary. Stories of women being kidnapped, held against their will, victims of opium, seduced by promises of luxuries in order to marry Chinese men. These were illustrations, cheap fiction, and later on films of women lost to immorality. They literally became yellow. So this was a kind of a form of racial downward mobility. Mary Louie has written about this in Chinatown Trunk Mystery, and she says, quote, "Through imparting the moral and social lesson for readers, popular depictions reassert the social and spatial boundaries by restraining the physical and social movement of Chinese men and white women of all socioeconomic classes." So in other words, these tales were mechanisms of social control. A class and racial reordering of the city. Chinatown was off limits to white women. Chinatown was only where the Chinese belong. This was, of course, a male fantasy, as Louis explained, stories that affirmed, quote, "mobility as a white male privilege," end quote. Some women obeyed, some women didn't, like Aunt Grace and Bessie. So I'm going to talk briefly about the meaning of Chinatown to white women. They were, in fact, they were involved in their own project of expanding their physical frontiers. At the time, there were very few spaces in which women could be. They were barred from restaurants quite explicitly for their own protection and reputation. These were social spaces in which men drank and made deals. There was also a lot of drinking. It was also a place, if you had a mistress, you would bring your mistress or prostitutes there. Probably didn't want your daughter, sister, or your wife to see you out with other women. But elite women were making a big claim to restaurants as a space in which they were entitled to. The Civic and Political League of New York City, a women's suffrage group, said, quote, "that women be protected in the civil rights and being entitled to food or shelter in any house of public entertainment by day or night," end quote. So this was an early part of the suffrage insistence that they be allowed to access spaces of commercial leisure. The Chinese were one of the first early ones to welcome women into their spaces. A sign outside of Montfarlow read, "Private dining rooms for ladies and their escorts, real Chinese food. No rough characters allowed, patronized by prominent New Yorkers." This appeared the very same year that the suffrage plank came out. So Chinese were redefining restaurants as safe for female customers. That was partially because Chinese restaurants were located deep in working class immigrant neighborhoods. So they had to do several extra assurances to make women feel physically and as well as metaphorically safe. And they were also appealing to women's desire for commodified exoticism. Mari Yoshihara describes in Embracing the Orient how women wearing kimonos during this period, because there was a great fascination with Japan during this period. It's a very similar relationship that you see with Chinese culture. Women were described in, quote, "ecstasy over heavenly carved ebony tables, dainty teacups, rice bowls, and dinner plates." Recall Osborne's description of her experience in Chinese restaurants. You saw things through the prism of these exoticized leisure. And Chinese restaurants were very much tapping into that. They weren't resisting it, they were tapping into it. There was also another kind of woman going to a restaurant, which was the more adventurous, younger types, and they were using restaurants to find husbands. This was also a moment in which there was a creation of heterosocial spaces. Christine Stanzel, in her book Modern Americans, has said this was, quote, "the mingling of men and women in conversation came to seem the very essence, the condition of modernity," end quote. Chinese restaurants in this shifting landscape was a new venue for courtship. Of course, this venue was it was a new frontier, but it was not lawless. One of the key components to female sociability in a heterosexual context was the premise of female initiation, which meant that women led. And this was a practiced form of self-protection because they were going to restaurants late at night. Women without male companions felt themselves vulnerable. So if she liked somebody at a dance hall, a theater, a saloon, she would ask them to meet up at a Chinese restaurant because they were, quote, described as having a free and easy atmosphere. Visitors lolled and talked and laughed loudly. The staff didn't interfere with what they were doing. They were freer to explore their sexuality on their own terms. And you see examples of men and women engaging in intimate acts of courtship, flirtation, kissing, sometimes much more in semi-privacy. So, but more than defining the limits of their own individual sexuality, they were working in teams of two and socializing them into a culture of modern womanhood and proper dating rituals. But these were, okay, but these were trivial costs, the larger scheme of things. Meeting, a meal, and deference to women's choice were actually small assurances. Courtship rituals and mating was once decided by elders or your parents or, you know, a different sort of social network. So they were suddenly in power of their own futures, and oftentimes rules of female initiation was sadly not enough. One of the Vice investigators that I'm reading to sort of understand these heterosexual contexts described a story of a woman being kidnapped out of a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown and being held captive for several days after being drunkenly intoxicated by men and later on rescued by her friends. So these kinds of stories that women were telling one another, he was overhearing actually women telling stories to one another, were reminders of the dangers to single women of heterosexual and heterosocial spaces in a world of mixed spheres. But ultimately, overall, Chinese restaurants, marginal businesses for marginal people, underwent a dramatic transformation through the patronage of white women. Average white women possessed particularized forms of influence, virtues of their race and gender, and their endorsement transformed Chinese restaurants into mainstream institutions. They played the role of tastemakers, and in the aggregate, normalized Chinese restaurants for people across a broad socioeconomic spectrum. The Chinese recognized this opportunity, and what they did was to move restaurants then out of Chinatown. By 1901, the New York Tribune was already noting that a large number of restaurants were out of Chinatown. And this meant a kind of market change in this moment. Remember how I said Montfarlot did two purposes, fancy banquets and ordinary food? These two purposes split in this moment. On the one hand, you had the cheap chop suey joint, which you see on the right. Not very much of the decor actually signifies Chinese restaurants, but they sold very simple menus and high variations of them. They were open late, cheap, and convenient, and these were a form of early fast food. They were located primarily around transportation hubs, and you would hear stories of people coming home from work carrying pails of chop suey, so early takeout, right? And this was also something embraced by bohemians. The counterculture said that there were no parties that were complete without a pail of chop suey. The other type of restaurant to emerge out of this split was the Americanized version of the upscale dining experience. So this is a map primarily of those upscale restaurants, and they were, most of them by the 19-teens, 1920s, were known as dine-in dances, because cabarets were popular at the time, and the Chinese copied this formula. Providence, your first one was called Port Arthur's, which is sadly no longer around. But Chin Lee's, if you recall the poster of this, was one of the most famous dine-in dances of its era. The president, whose name it was named after, and father of civil rights activist Grace Lee Boggs, was involved in 9 restaurants in the Northeast. And he considered the one that was on the poster his crowning achievement. The restaurant was very successful. Immediately, it was filled to capacity on weekends. They made $2,000 to $3,000 a night, which is roughly about $60,000 to $70,000 a night. And Grace Lee Boggs recalled when she was a child working in them, the atmosphere, the hurried atmosphere, little waiters carrying huge trays of food. People ate quickly. There was a turnover of 2 or 3 times a night. Hundreds of customers passed through Chin Lee's door. Alongside the customers, though, partners were also coming and going, and they were using restaurants for immigration purposes to legally leave and re-enter the United States. So now I'm going to return to the topic of exclusion, part 3. How then exclusion spurred the restaurant boom after World War I. We've already talked about how it created the concept of Chinese food. So at the passage of exclusion in 1882, there were over 100,000 Chinese already in the United States. Most of them would have been excluded, so hence not able to enter the country. So what that meant is very much what the border wall does. It traps people who are here in the country. In these laws, I said that there were all kinds of ways in which it failed. There were exemptions for business owners, what was called merchant status. And merchant status allowed an individual to visit China and as well sponsor relatives into the country. What this meant was that immigration law specific to the Chinese actually incentivized the Chinese to go into business. And every opportunity for these tens of thousands of individuals already here counted. Laundries, as I mentioned, was the most common form. They explicitly did not qualify because they were considered excluded manual laborers. Restaurant owners, from the early phase of exclusion, was making the argument that they should be exempt. There was an early case in 1894 in Seattle that disqualified them, which the judge who rationalized this said he related it to blacksmithing, tailoring, and shoemaking, which he called skilled workmen by popular estimation. So in his eyes, in the late 19th century, Chinese restaurants were not important enough to be considered proper businesses. The Chinese fought. And there are far too many cases to talk about, so I'm just going to focus on one. So this is a man named Horin. He's the man on the right. And he was a partner in two businesses, a grocery store that had a branch in Chinatown, as well as New York, as well as one in Boston. And as well as he was invested in a restaurant called Man Fong Lo that also claimed the title of Oriental Delmonico's. Very confusing, as you can imagine. But he roughly had $60,000 invested in these two businesses. And in 1906, before the case, he certified his merchant status and was able to bring his wife and daughter to the United States. Boston, however, did not let them through. They said that he never mentioned that he owned a restaurant. They charged him with human trafficking. It became a big spectacle and embarrassment because it also turned out that he owned a fancy, it wasn't just any restaurant, it was a very nice restaurant. It was a well-known restaurant. Immigration advocates came to rally behind him, and the most important person was a man named Max Kohler. He was a former USDA turned immigration lawyer, and he threatened to take the Horin case all the way to the Supreme Court. He had already argued a case in 1903, so this was somebody that the immigration officials took very seriously. The Commissioner General at the time, Frank Sargent, conceded the case out of bureaucratic terms in order to avoid setting another precedent that would overturn the 1894 Act. So at the end of that, the question of whether restaurant owners were merchants was not adjudicated, and the case held for a few more years, but this is in the middle of a very long fight that the Chinese had been fighting in New York. They were fighting through the courts, like in this case, but they were also informally pressuring the Bureau to change its policy. And ironically, in 1913, a case that involved an excluded laundryman ended up being the case that overturns this earlier ruling. So after that, it set a national precedent that allowed restaurant owners to enter as merchants. And after the Treaty of Versailles, after peace, after World War I, you saw a big restaurant boom. So Chinese laborers started opening restaurants, and these were highly rationalized ways of operating them. They were eking out as many merchant statuses as possible. And I call this a migration-oriented business model. And this is based on hundreds of immigration cases that I turned into a database called the Chinese Restaurant Database, which if you come to the workshop tomorrow, I'll talk about how I created it. But a very similar pattern in New York is repeated in Boston, Philadelphia, Providence, and Chicago, which meant that the Chinese found success in New York and they exported it through other cities. And the strategy for sharing this information was primarily through social networks and primarily through organizations connected to Tom Lay. So he, again, likes to be at the center of things. Interestingly, in San Francisco, where there were more Chinese and also the first Chinese restaurants, the restaurant industry really didn't function in the same way. There were far fewer of them, they were not geographically dispersed, and they had a much smaller market with Chinese individuals. And this is partially, again, because of the legacies of the anti-Chinese movement. So what I think this does is calls for the respatialization of immigration history. European story on the east, like here, and Asian story on the west. The history of restaurants shows you that the interaction between Europeans and Asian-descended immigrants was actually at the core of what was happening. You see an example, I don't talk about it here, but people who are considered white of another kind are also making America, making America white through their participation in this in this restaurant industry, and I can save that for the Q&A. Maybe I'll just give you a brief example. You know, Elena Keegan at her confirmation hearing was asked, where were you on the night of the Christmas Day bombing? And she said, quite cheekily, quote, like all Jews, I was probably at a Chinese restaurant, end quote. So what does this story of Chinese restaurants tell us that we don't already know? On one hand, we see the Chinese integrating into American society. They're usually portrayed as isolated people, here to make here for a brief time to make money and to go home. They lived apart in Chinatown, following Chinese-only customs. However, that was clearly not true. They were trying to integrate themselves, and they were aggressively building bridges of interracial understanding. However, this is not visible if we take the prevailing assumption that Chinese food became popular because it was cheap, it was delicious, and that the Chinese were really only doing it for economic survival. The takeaway is that I want you to be suspicious of isolationist narratives. There's no wall around Chinatown, just like there's no wall around undocumented people today. So what were people at the fringes innovating that we don't see as a result of these narratives that we hold to? On the other hand, America was also transformed. Average women and men were eating very differently. In Chinese, this early experience with cross-cultural eating paved the way for other cuisines to fill in similar spaces. So immigrant spaces like restaurants were important sites of negotiation between people who rarely interacted. And American culture was really produced in these spaces. Beneath the veneer of a Chinese banquet hall lay a knotted story of Chinese battling legal marginalization. Over the years, they established a dining culture, a precursor to fashionable foodie trends. Their efforts give us both new modes of interaction. So what I'm calling you to do is to ask yourself, who makes America then? Perhaps look to the weak, to the marginalized, and not to celebrate America as a land of opportunity, but to recognize the blood, sweat, and tears of the invisible, like the Chinese workers who were excluded from Hopper's Chinese restaurant painting. Thank you.